I'm sitting here in a lovely garden at the Jacques Marchais Museum of Tibetan Art on Staten Island, and I think this is a very appropriate setting for a program on happiness, specifically what the great thinkers in philosophy, religion, psychology, literature have said about happiness over the centuries. And a good place to begin, I think, is with a quotation from someone not known to be a deep thinker, but nevertheless provides a good point of departure for a program on happiness. Darryl Strawberry, former baseball star, has had his problems with alcohol and other drugs and has been suspended from baseball several times because of those problems. And Strawberry said this. He said, "I know everything about hitting, but nothing about living." One of the most important questions that's been raised concerning the issue of happiness is how happy can we be? And I must tell you that there is serious disagreement among the great thinkers about what degree of happiness we can achieve in this life. Bertrand Russell, very famous philosopher and mathematician of this century, was quite optimistic. Russell wrote a book when he was 58 years of age entitled The Conquest of Happiness. And the reason he wrote the book is that in this book he pointed out that when he was very young, he was constantly on the verge of suicide. And indeed what kept him going was his interest in mathematics. Comments that as he grew older, he learned how to be happy. And in this book, again entitled The Conquest of Happiness, he explains what he learned about becoming a happy person. And let me just give you a short passage from Russell's book. He says this: "In adolescence, I hated life and was constantly on the verge of suicide. Now at the age of 58, on the contrary, I enjoy life. I might almost say that with every year that passes, I enjoy it more." But I must tell you that there are many famous thinkers who disagree with Russell and his optimism about how happy we can be. And one of those thinkers is Sigmund Freud. Freud, in one of his most famous books entitled Civilization and Its Discontents, expressed his ideas about how happy we can be. And he said this, and I'm quoting Freud: "One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation." He goes on to say, though, that yet we cannot give up our efforts to bring it nearer to fulfillment by some means or other. So on the one hand, Freud is saying that as he sees it, we can't really be very happy, but he also believes, on the other hand, that we should try. And he gives an explanation as to why he thinks our prospects for happiness are not very good. He says this. He says happiness is only possible as an episodic phenomenon. He says our constitution is such, our human nature is such, that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. The question is Freud alone in this rather pessimistic view of our prospects for happiness? No, he's not. But before I give you some other views, let me point out today's working definition of happiness. When I'm talking about happiness, I'm defining it as a feeling of contentment and peace of mind. And I think most people would agree with that definition. Many dictionaries give that definition of happiness. Again, a feeling of contentment and peace of mind. With regard to Freud's comments, so many religions teach in one way or another that life is a vale of tears. And Henry David Thoreau, famous American thinker, in his masterpiece, Walden, said this: "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And Shakespeare, in Hamlet, has Hamlet, in perhaps the most famous soliloquy in all of literature, say this, and again these are Hamlet's words. He talks about, in the to be or not to be soliloquy, the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. In my presentation today, I'll be focusing on the following in our quest for happiness. I'll be talking about the role of knowledge and love and virtue and money and worthwhile activity. in our pursuit of happiness. And in a later program, part 2 actually, I'll be dealing with the following aspects of our quest for happiness: dealing with adversity, sex, dealing with fears and desires, the role of physical exercise in trying to become a happier human being, and finally, spirituality. I alluded before to Bertrand Russell's very famous book, The Conquest of Happiness, and let me tell you what he learned about becoming a happier person. And he sums it up pretty well early on in the book. He says this. He says, "My view is this: the good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge." And he goes on to say that neither love without knowledge nor knowledge without love can produce a good life. Which raises the question, when he says that love and knowledge are indispensable to our pursuit of happiness, well, what knowledge is he talking about? Well, Russell and so many of the famous thinkers over the centuries, philosophers, religionists, etc., are pretty specific in talking about what kind of knowledge is extremely important to our pursuit of happiness. And they talk about knowledge of oneself. You recall the ancient Greek maxim, know thyself. And they talk about knowledge of others and also knowledge of life. How often we have heard middle-aged people or elderly people say, if I only knew today, if I only knew at age 20 what I know today. And really, what is someone saying? What's the meaning of that expression? If I only knew at 20 what I know today. I think what they're saying is that if they knew at 20 what they know today, perhaps they would have avoided a lot of unhappiness. Perhaps they would have avoided a lot of grief. So they also, when people use that expression, are emphasizing the role of knowledge in becoming a happier person. And specifically, the idea that with greater understanding, we can avoid much pain and grief in this life. On the subject of the importance of knowledge, Muhammad, often referred to as the founder of Islam, said this. He said, "To spend more time in learning is better than spending more time in praying." He goes on to say, "Acquire knowledge. It is our friend in solitude, our companion when friendless. It guideth us to happiness. It sustaineth us in misery." And it's interesting that Socrates, also on the subject of the importance of knowledge and understanding, said that he believed understanding is even more important than pleasure in trying to pursue happiness. In fact, here are Socrates' own words. He says, the many think pleasure to be the good, and the smarter sort say understanding. And Aristotle believed that to fulfill our nature, we must learn. That Aristotle believed that our human nature is such that learning is indispensable to living a good life. And Aristotle, like Socrates, like Muhammad, like Bertrand Russell, emphasizes the importance of acquiring knowledge as being essential to becoming a happier human being. I'd like to get very specific in talking about the kinds of knowledge that may be very helpful to us in our pursuit of happiness. We're talking here about knowledge of oneself, we're talking about knowledge of others, and we're talking about knowledge of life. I wish to zero in now on knowledge of oneself. I mentioned before the ancient Greek maxim, know thyself. The Buddha, on a similar topic, said this: much of your pain is self-chosen. The Buddhists believe that we bring much of our pain upon ourselves because of a lack of knowledge. The Dalai Lama has talked about the importance of learning about our thoughts and emotions. The Dalai Lama has said this: the first step in seeking happiness is learning. Learning about your positive and negative emotions. Some of the Buddhists described the human mind as being like a crazed monkey cavorting about in a cage. Sogyal Rinpoche, famous Buddhist thinker, describes the ordinary mind as being characterized by the following. And again, when he talks about the ordinary mind, he's talking about your mind and my mind, and its ordinary state. Rinpoche says our ordinary mind is often characterized by anger, greed, jealousy, spite, anxiety, lust, fear, and turmoil. The Buddha emphasized the enormous power our thoughts have over us. And in a very famous book called the Dhammapada, a book of quotations by the Buddha put together by his disciples, the Buddha said this. The Buddha said, "We are what we think. With our thoughts, we make the world." And he goes on to say that your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own thoughts left unguarded. And it is interesting that so many of the great philosophers, so many of the great religionists talk about self-conquest, talk about self-mastery, and you might wonder, what does that mean, self-conquest, self-mastery? Well, it means living in such a way that you're learning how to exercise more and more control over your thoughts and emotions. The Buddhists say that self-knowledge begins with introspection, and there is a favorite Buddhist word that they use in conjunction with this idea, and that is the word mindfulness. And what does mindfulness mean? Well, to the Buddhists, mindfulness means observing one's own mind, using one's mind to observe one's mind. And the Buddhists claim that our mind often is in a negative state, at other times is in a positive state, and that one of the keys to achieving greater happiness is reducing the amount of time our mind is in a negative state and increasing the time that our mind is in a positive state. Now you might ask, what do they mean by a negative state? Well, let me get very specific. The Buddhists say that anger, hatred, and greed are characteristics of a negative state of mind. On the contrary, the Buddhists say that kindness, compassion, and tolerance constitute a positive state of mind. And they go on to say this, that anger, hatred, and greed lead to suffering, whereas kindness, compassion, and tolerance lead to happiness. The Dalai Lama has said that taming the mind is the most important task of one's life. And what does he mean by taming the mind? Well, by taming the mind, he means that when we recognize that we're in a negative state of mind, whether it be anger or greed, that we come up with some antidote so that we can end that negative state of mind and move into a positive state of mind. Again, going back to the idea of mindfulness, and as a consequence of mindfulness, the idea of taming the mind. It's important to realize that instant gratification can be very harmful to our pursuit of happiness. The Buddhists talk about concentrating on the ultimate consequences of one's thoughts and actions. For example, eating. I suspect all of us at times eat too much. And what are we into? We're into instant gratification. And we don't think about the ultimate consequences of our eating too much. Whether it's a bloated stomach, whether it's putting on weight, whether it's feeling tired. So the Buddhists, again, talk about the importance of realizing that instant gratification is often very bad for us. The Buddhists emphasize the importance of solitude in acquiring self-knowledge. Indeed, they say that stillness and quietness are extremely important in our efforts to achieve knowledge about ourselves. And of course, they also emphasize meditation. Some religions emphasize prayer. The Buddhists emphasize meditation. And the Dalai Lama, in talking about meditation in his own life, talks about the different kinds of meditating. And he says one form of meditation that he engages in on a daily basis is simply reminding himself every day about different ways of dealing with the problems of daily existence. So he says that when we meditate, yes, there is the way of meditating by focusing it on one's breath or focusing it on some object, but also another equally important kind of meditation is simply reminding yourself every day about certain important ideas that you wish to remember about living a more fulfilling life. I've been talking about self-knowledge as an element of the good life. I wish now to talk about another kind of knowledge, probably equally important, and that's a knowledge of life. So many of the great thinkers in describing life, in one way or another, have said that it's bittersweet. Joseph Campbell, professor of mythology for many years at Sarah Lawrence College, described life this way. He said, life's great, but it hurts. Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck, in the very first sentence of his very famous book, The Road Less Traveled, said this. He said, life is difficult. Mother Teresa has said that suffering will never be completely absent from our lives. Life, of course, has its upside and its downside. It has its peaks and it has its valleys. Part of the upside of life, of course, is loving other people, a lovely spring day, little children, worthwhile activity, music. The downside of life, I think, is obvious to all of us. The anxiety many of us experience, perhaps all of us experience on a daily basis, even nervousness, sometimes loneliness, fear of accident, fear of disease, injustice, which perhaps all of us to varying degrees experience in life. Which raises the question, what might be the proper attitude towards life? Many of the famous thinkers, in one way or another, have said the proper attitude of life consists of acknowledging that life is bittersweet. That yes, life has its good times, but it also has its sadness, its problems. But that nevertheless, we can get better at living. Indeed, Thoreau in Walden refers to the art of living. And Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, says that when he was a very young man, he designed a plan for living, a self-improvement plan. And he said that while he never achieved the virtues to the degree that he wished to, that nevertheless, since he had a self-improvement plan, it did facilitate his efforts to become a happier person. And he believed that he was a happier person because he had developed such a plan. I suspect that perhaps the wisest words ever said on the topic of what might be the proper attitude towards life come from the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr, in a very famous prayer, one I suspect many of you are familiar with, said this. He said, God, grant me the serenity to accept what cannot be changed, and the courage to change what can be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference between what can be changed and what cannot be changed. Thus far, in emphasizing the role of knowledge in living a happier life, I've talked about the importance of self-knowledge and the importance of a knowledge of life, of reality, of the way things really are. What I wish to do now is to zero in on another kind of knowledge, and that is knowledge of other people, because so many of the famous psychologists, philosophers, etc., have said that this also is indispensable if we're going to move to higher levels of awareness and happiness. And what I've done is to just jot down some of the characteristics that I think applicable to most, if not all, human beings. So let me go through the list. I think it's fair to say that human beings are complicated. In fact, Pascal, the famous French philosopher, said that we have two natures, one good and one bad. We are shaped by our environment, but we are also shaped by our genes. I think it's accurate to say that human beings tend to be self-centered. They seek approval, status, power, even glory. Many people do, probably the majority. I think it's also fair to say that human beings have the potential to become less self-centered. And also, another characteristic of human beings that the literature in psychology especially tells us is that it's not unusual that human beings experience feelings of inferiority. On a very positive note, of course, human beings can become much more virtuous. And indeed, there are so many examples in history of people who were very virtuous people, of people who did remarkable things for other human beings. And of course, I'm thinking, among others, of Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mother Teresa. Which raises the question, what might be the proper attitude that we should have towards other human beings? And I think Longfellow provides us with some help here. He said this. He said, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. And it is interesting that both Bertrand Russell and Schopenhauer, the famous German philosopher, believe that the proper attitude towards other people is to regard them as our fellow sufferers. I know that sounds rather pessimistic, but the idea is that, yes, we do experience joy, but we all do suffer. And that might be an appropriate way to think about other human beings. The Buddhists and many others emphasize the importance of compassion. And I think the most beautiful sentence I ever read on the subject of compassion comes from philosopher Eric Hoffer, who said this. Hoffer said, "Compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Where there is compassion, even our most poisonous impulses remain relatively harmless." I've been talking about the importance of knowledge of self, knowledge of others, and knowledge of life in moving to higher levels of awareness and hopefully higher levels of happiness. And the question is, where does one go to acquire this knowledge? What I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to make some suggestions to you, suggestions that have worked for me, and perhaps they will work for you also. And they're not original suggestions. I think the first thing we must all do is to engage in introspection. I've mentioned that before. Solitude is very important if we're going to achieve significant introspection. And I think also good books are instrumental in helping us to evaluate our experiences. And what I've done here is I've jotted down some books that you might find helpful. Perhaps you've already read some of them. Maybe you've read all of them. These are books in literature, in philosophy, in psychology, and religion. At the top of my list is a book called The Art of Happiness, co-authored by the Dalai Lama and Howard Cutler, a rather famous American psychiatrist. And also another self-help book that was on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 10 years is a book called The Road Less Traveled by psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. And among books of antiquity, I would highly recommend Marcus Aurelius' Meditations and Seneca's Letters from a Stoic. Also among writers of recent centuries, I would recommend Thoreau's Walden. I would recommend Shakespeare's Hamlet, Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. And of course, I think one should read the Bible, the Holy Bible, especially the New Testament, in my opinion. And also, I mentioned the Dhammapada before. The Dhammapada is a collection of quotations by the Buddha put together by some of his disciples. Besides engaging in introspection and reading valuable books, I think other ways of acquiring the kind of knowledge we need is provided by good music, good art, especially good movies, I think. The kinds of movies made by the Swedish director Ingmar Bergman and the Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa. I think good classes, good teachers can be very helpful. Good TV and radio. And indeed, even our own suffering can help us to achieve higher levels of happiness. In fact, Pascal, famous French philosopher, said this, and he's talking about using our suffering to move to higher levels of happiness. He says this: 1 hour's pain is a better teacher than all the philosophers put together. Just recently, I saw Michael J. Fox, the famous actor, on television. You probably know that some years ago he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And he was talking about the disease in a book he's just written about his ailment. And he said that his suffering, his disease, has actually helped him in many significant ways. And he said that he actually has more peace of mind now than he had before acquiring Parkinson's disease. Earlier in the program, I alluded to Bertrand Russell's book, The Conquest of Happiness, in which he writes about what he learned concerning how to become a happier human being. And I mentioned to you that he said that the good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge. So far in my presentation, I've emphasized knowledge. What I wish to do now is to emphasize love, the role of love in helping us to become happier human beings. And the definition of love I would like to use is one that's provided by ethicist Joseph Fletcher, a professor who has defined love in the following way. He says that love is justice, that when we love people, we treat them fairly. And it is interesting that so many of the philosophers and religionists and men and women of letters, in talking about the role of love in the good life, emphasize the idea of ego reduction. That yes, we do tend to be self-centered human beings, but that if we're going to be happier human beings, it's important that we try to be less self-centered, and that therefore we engage in what so many of them call ego reduction. In loving other people, of course, we render service to them. We help other people. And this, of course, also can be extremely important in helping us to live more fulfilling lives. And if we're going to love other people, it is important that, of course, we love ourselves. Indeed, so many commentators have said it probably is not possible to love other people if one doesn't love oneself. And when I talk about loving oneself, I'm not talking about vanity. I'm not talking about conceit. Self-love, among other things, means self-respect. And it also means being able to tolerate certain things about ourselves that we cannot change. And of course, trying to change those things that we can. And another aspect of self-love, a very important aspect of self-love, I think, is self-reliance. And one of the things that self-reliance involves is being able to enjoy solitude if one is going to live the good life, the happy life, so to speak. It seems to me, and it seems to many others whom I've read, that enjoying one's own company is indispensable to living a happier life. St. Francis of Assisi, on the subject of love, said that it is important that we be more concerned with loving other people than in being loved. And Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, on the same subject, raised the question, what is hell? And Dostoevsky said this. He said, hell is the suffering of being unable to love. Closely associated with love in living the good life is virtue. So many of the famous thinkers have emphasized the importance of being a decent human being if we are to live happier lives. Seneca, the famous Stoic philosopher, said that virtue is the key to happiness. And in one of his most famous utterances, he said this, in the long run, honesty, justice, forbearance, kindliness bring us more happiness than ever comes from the pursuit of pleasure. And Marcus Aurelius, Seneca's fellow Stoic philosopher, said this. He said, know the joy of life by piling good deed on good deed until no rift or cranny appears between them. Douglas Labia is a psychoanalyst who also has emphasized the importance of virtue. Some years ago, he gave an interview to a news magazine in which he talked about many of his patients and the fact that many of them are very successful people. In fact, he referred to them as yuppies. But he said that despite the fact that many of his patients, who in fact live in Washington, D.C., where he was practicing at the time, have jobs in government, have jobs in science, have jobs at universities, that nevertheless, despite the fact that they are successful careerists, suffer from a variety of mental ailments, including depression and paranoia, and also physical complaints. And he says that some of the reasons for their emotional problems are the following. He says that many of them have made compromises and trade-offs in the pursuit of their career that have actually had a detrimental effect on their mental health. And in fact, let me quote psychoanalyst Douglas Labia. He says this, in the course of molding themselves to the attitudes and values needed for success in many organizations, many professionals feel they have betrayed themselves. He says there is also much rage among these people. And also he says that many of them have very shallow relationships and have a consumerist attitude towards other people. He says that, for example, in climbing the corporate ladder, many people use other people to move up the ladder, and once they are successful in using these people, they kind of throw them away. And Labia offers some solutions to these people for their problems. And among the solutions he suggests to these patients are the following. He says they need a more balanced life, one not so focused on career, And he also says, and I think this is very germane to what I'm talking about today in connection with virtue, he says they need to develop the interior life. And he's very specific. He said they need to cultivate moral courage. They need to cultivate the habit of acting according to principles. They need to try to love people and to give to other people. Labir says it's also important that organizations, for example, corporations, establish conditions, working conditions, that are very conducive to mental health. Many commentators have remarked about the connection between virtue and self-respect, and one of the more succinct comments on this subject I ever read comes from the actor Henry Winkler. And he said this, he said, self-respect is the cornerstone of joy. I find it interesting that so many of the great thinkers over the centuries have said that it is in our self-interest and our selfish interest to be virtuous people. This is not to say that unhappiness is always or even usually caused by a lack of virtue. We know that depression, for example, has many different causes. And I'm sure that there are very decent people who experience depression. Indeed, some of Gandhi's biographers claim that at times he experienced depression. And Albert Schweitzer, perhaps the greatest humanitarian of this century, in his writings talked about the numerous times he experienced great anxiety and even nervousness and fatigue. No discussion of happiness would be adequate without discussing the role of money and the connection between money and happiness. So for the next few minutes, that's what I would like to deal with. Perhaps the most important question that one can ask oneself with regard to money is what can money buy and what can't money buy? We know that money can buy less fear and worry about not having it. I remember seeing Johnny Carson interviewed years ago, and he said the greatest benefit to him of making a lot of money was not having to worry about money. But he also added that other worries have replaced his worries about money. It's also true that money can buy material comfort and leisure. And leisure is no small thing in life. In fact, leisure can often allow us the time to do the reading that we need to move to higher levels of consciousness. What can't money buy? Well, among the things money can't buy complete security. It can't buy complete peace of mind. We know that even people with a lot of money are equally vulnerable to accidents, to disease, and of course to death. And we know that money cannot buy love, money cannot buy talent, it can't buy self-discipline, it can't buy self-mastery, and it can't buy self-respect. Perhaps the two most important questions, besides the ones I've already raised, concerning money, are the following. And that is, what are you doing to get the money? What is one doing to get the money? Is what you're doing to get the money good for your soul? And also, what is one spending it on? Is one spending one's money on impressing others, for example? And is that a road to happiness? Another aspect of happiness concerns the way in which we use our time. Some activities are more worthwhile than others. Some activities are more meaningful than others. And on this subject, the writer Herman Melville said this: we become sad in the first place because we have nothing stirring to do. And Bertrand Russell said this: the more things a man is interested in, the more opportunities of happiness he has. I think it's fair to say that happiness is a byproduct of meaningful activity. The ancient Greeks spoke of the importance of a sound mind and a sound body. They talked about the significance of mental exercise every day and also physical exercise on a daily basis. Psychologists talk about the state of flow, and that one of our objectives should be to try to get ourselves into the state of flow. And what does that mean? The state of flow involves concentrating on something. It could be a book, it could be building something, it could be doing something in the way of carpentry. But in any event, you know that you're in the state of flow when you're concentrating to the extent that you lose sense of time, that you're so focused that you forget about your problems and you forget about time. In this context, the writer Willa Cather says this about happiness, and I'm quoting him. That is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. Thoreau, in talking about meaningful activity, suggested that free and inexpensive interests are the best. In fact, here are his own words. Thoreau said, "The man is richest whose pleasures are the cheapest." And what might be some examples of meaningful activity? Well, we all have our own version. Let me give you some samples from my version. To me, and perhaps to many of you watching, reading is one of the most meaningful activities that I can engage in. Walking in the park, helping others, meaningful conversation, spiritual practices, for example, meditation, different forms of intellectual stimulation. It could involve watching programs like Book Notes on C-SPAN, or listening to public radio, or even some very informative programs on network television. Creating, building. Do you have a talent at carpentry? Do you have a talent at electrical work? It seems to me that one of the best ways to get into flow can be by working with one's hands and creating something. And also, I think, another example of meaningful activity is vigorous physical exercise. Another ingredient of the happy life, strangely enough, may be the ability to endure boredom. Bertrand Russell, whom I've quoted several times today, said this: "A certain power of enduring boredom is therefore essential to a happy life." You might find that strange. Here is Russell's explanation. Russell says that certain good things cannot happen in life unless one has the ability to endure boredom. He talks about fruitful monotony. He says, for example, that one will not learn to play the violin very well unless one can put up with the monotony of practicing many hours. One will not become an Olympic swimmer unless one can sustain practicing many hours, which often involves moments of boredom. If one is writing a book, one will necessarily make many revisions. One may end up writing the same page 5, 10, 15 times. That can be very boring. So again, Russell is saying that certain good things cannot happen to us in life unless we can endure a certain amount of boredom. Perhaps one of the most significant causes of unhappiness in life is having unrealistic expectations. I suspect if we were to interview many psychiatrists and psychologists, they would tell us that one of the most common forms or causes of unhappiness is having unrealistic expectations. So that if we are going to live happier lives, it's important that we avoid expectations concerning life that aren't realistic. Another cause of happiness, I suspect, and again many others have said this in their writings, is being suspicious of the majority. I know this sounds strange since we live in a democratic country, and I myself very much believe in democracy. But I'm talking about a particular perspective, one illustrated by a comment from the Buddha in the Dhammapada. The Buddha says the world is in darkness and how few have the eyes to see. And in this context, again, I'm talking about the idea of being suspicious of the majority. Something else that I think can be very helpful to us in living more fulfilling lives is to do what Bertrand Russell suggests in his book called The Conquest of Happiness. And that is, he says, we need effort, but we also need resignation. And a very famous holy book, the Bhagavad Gita, also preaches the same theme. That in life, yes, it's very important that we give it our best shot, but that we must remember that there are many things over which we have no control. And after we give it our best shot, we have no alternative but to resign ourselves to whatever happens. In bringing my presentation to a close, I'd like to raise the question, what does a happy person look like? And among the answers I have read and heard is that a happy person may indeed look the way the Buddha looks, that a happy person has an expression of calmness, of understanding, and of compassion. To summarize, in this program, I've talked about what might be some of the significant causes of happiness in life. I've talked about the role of knowledge, specifically self-knowledge, knowledge of others, and knowledge of life. I've talked about the importance of love in the good life and the importance of showing other people affection and rendering service to other people. I've talked about the importance of virtue, and I've suggested to you that it might be in our selfish interest to be good human beings. And that's not my opinion. Actually, it is my opinion, but more importantly, it's the opinion of so many philosophers and so many religionists. I've also talked about the importance of money, and talked about the importance of money in this context, that it's important to know what money can buy and what money can't buy. That yes, there may be some elements of happiness that money can help us to achieve, but that there may be many other elements, such as the ones I mentioned, self-conquest, self-discipline, self-respect, love, that money cannot buy. And of course, I mentioned meaningful activity. If we are going to be happy human beings, so much of it depends on what we do with our time, how we use our time each day. And in fact, I mentioned that some people have said that happiness is a byproduct of meaningful activity. And finally, I talked about the importance, perhaps, of being able to endure boredom. That, as Bertrand Russell said, that certain good things may not be able to happen to us unless we can endure a certain amount of boredom. Remember, he talked about fruitful monotony, such as that experienced by the violin player. And also, I talked about effort and resignation, the idea that in this life, there are only so many things we control, and that perhaps the key is giving it our best shot and then resigning ourselves to the consequences. And I mentioned that a very famous holy book, the Bhagavad Gita, promotes this theme. I'd like to conclude with a quote from the poet John Milton. Milton said, "The mind is its own place, and of itself can make a hell of heaven or a heaven of hell."